Cybernetics and modern systems theory emerged in the latter half of the 20th century. Systems theory was originally developed by Ludwig von Bertalanffy as an approach to analyze physical, biological, and social systems alike. Around the same time, Norbert Wiener developed an interdisciplinary theory of self-regulating systems, which he called cybernetics. Together with other 20th century inventions, such as the Turing machine, these developments set in motion a technological revolution and a series of groundbreaking interdisciplinary exchanges and contributed to an epistemological shift in the latter half of the century. The German sociologist Niklas Luhmann sought to develop a new sociology grounded in systems theory and cybernetics. After Talcott Parsons had already taken steps towards a systems-based sociology, Luhmann developed his own version of a comprehensive systems theory of society over more than 30 years. His theory includes a rigorous critique of classical ontology, which I will explore in this video. To make sense of that critique, however, I will first outline some of the basic concepts in Luhmann's work. Luhmann differentiates between at least three kinds of systems: living systems, psychic systems, and social systems. Living systems define themselves by material boundaries in space. By drawing a distinction between system and environment, they effectively create and maintain themselves. Psychic and social systems also create themselves through that distinction, but for them, boundaries are not material artifacts, they are two-sided forms. I will explain what a form is in a moment. What matters here is that Luhmann's systems are operationally closed. By closedness, Luhmann means that processes from the environment cannot simply permeate the border and continue unaltered inside the system. Rather, they undergo transformation. Systems are irritated by their environment and process these irritations according to their own logic. For example, psychic systems operate with thoughts and feelings, and since they are operationally closed, thoughts in one psychic system cannot directly connect to those in another. To interact, they must be structurally coupled through language. Thoughts are translated into language, which can then irritate other psychic systems. Those irritations are in turn transformed into new thoughts and feelings. Another psychic system cannot simply share thoughts with my mind. Even if it could, those thoughts would be mine and would be transformed when interpreted within the closed psychic system that is my mind. Sharing thoughts without intermediaries would only be possible if the other psychic system could plant a thought directly in my mind and then continue thinking it. But in that case, my mind would no longer function as its own psychic system. It would simply become an extension of the other system. In the same way, biological and psychic systems, as well as psychic and social systems, are coupled to one another. Psychic systems cannot exist without their connection to certain biological systems, and social systems cannot exist without psychic systems. Yet they are not simply extensions of one another. Each is a self-contained, operationally closed system. Another key feature of Luhmann's systems is that they are self-referential. Self-reference becomes possible for psychic and social systems because they replicate the system-environment distinction within themselves. Luhmann calls this internalization the re-entry. In this case, re-entry means that the system-environment distinction occurs twice over, as difference produced through the system and as difference observed in the system. This does not mean that the system becomes self-conscious, but that it has achieved a form of self-referential closedness. Now let's take a social system as an example. In the legal system, the re-entered system-environment distinction takes the form of a distinction between legal communication, that consists of rulings, procedures, documents, and so on, and non-legal communication, that you will find in other social systems such as politics or art. Legal communication operates with the distinction legal versus illegal. This abstract foundational distinction is the system's code, and it becomes operative through programs. Programs specify the conditions under which something can be considered legal or illegal. They thereby also generate secondary distinctions such as willful versus negligent or guilty versus innocent. Programs are made possible by the system's memory function. Memory, together with self-reference, allows the system to reproduce itself over time. For example, any new verdict must refer both to the existing body of law and to previous verdicts. The communication that a system consists of is closed. Legal communication can only connect to legal communication and continue as such. In any other case, you are leaving the legal system. For instance, a protest cannot be evaluated by the legal system as effective or ugly. It can only be observed in legal terms. However, despite their self-referential closure, systems can still receive information from other systems and become structurally coupled with them. For example, a judge operates with the distinction guilty versus innocent. Yet the legal system can couple with the medical system through expert witnesses, translating the distinction between mentally ill and healthy into the legal category of criminal responsibility. As we have seen, unlike most philosophical approaches, Luhmann does not begin his theory with a single object or concept, but with a distinction, the system-environment distinction and its re-entry. Luhmann's ideas of the distinction as two-sided form and the re-entry are grounded in his interpretation of George Spencer Brown's laws of form. The laws of form begins with the imperative to draw a distinction. Drawing a distinction, as Spencer Brown makes clear, always involves two steps: differentiating two sides and designating one as the indicated side. We can imagine it as drawing a line on a blank sheet of paper and then marking one of the two sides created to distinguish them. The side that is not indicated now constitutes the surroundings of the indicated side. Luhmann calls this process the observation. An observation, in Luhmann's sense, does not necessarily have to be visual or tied to a person. It is just this act of differentiating and indicating. Strictly speaking, only the indicated side is actually observed. The other side builds the background or horizon of the indication, so to speak. An observing system can only operate on the inside of a distinction. For example, one might select man in contrast to woman, but if one wished to observe both woman and man at the same time, one would have to select both, which in turn creates a different background. One can never observe both the designated object and the background at the same time. Just as in formal logic, one cannot negate and affirm something at the same time. However, the undesignated side is a necessary part of the identity of the observed object. It is made up of a web of relations that qualifies the indicated object. A system can be irritated by its environment, and provided the re-entry of the system-environment distinction, it can interpret these irritations as information entering the system. But a system can never cross its boundary and be in the environment. Doing so would simply dissolve the system. Internalized distinctions, however, can be crossed. Once on the other side, the observer can designate what it finds there while retaining memory of the previous side. This crossing is costly in a sense, since it unfolds over time and relies on memory, but it can lead to a stabilized distinction with double-sided determinations, such as the code of a social system. By introducing time and memory, Luhmann moves away from formal logic and toward cybernetics and biology. The drawing of a distinction and the act of indication is just a special case of a more general mechanism that Luhmann calls surplus production and selection. Whenever a distinction is drawn and a side is indicated, it is assumed that there is more than what is indicated. In other words, an indication in the context of a distinction is a selection from a surplus of possibilities. With this insight, Luhmann connects logic to evolutionary biology and systems theory. Whenever we, as psychic systems, turn towards something, negation necessarily accompanies our experience. For example, I may turn towards an object because I've already negated the danger it may contain. Danger is generalized and negated as a whole. But if negation would mean that I can't bring it back, it could be fatal. Fortunately, when an identity is fixed, all the other possibilities are not necessarily lost. They are merely set aside for the moment and remain in the background. This can be useful later, since in some unforeseeable future, one of those possibilities may become important again. Therefore, an identity is never settled for good. Any negation can always be applied upon itself. In practice, there are, of course, limits. Sometimes possibilities are permanently lost. The passage of time, for instance, destroys them. Although in theory every selection can be negated and thereby reversed, doing so still involves risk. On the one hand, the ever-present horizon signals instability because every identity could be different. On the other hand, it creates stability because if something goes wrong, one can always actualize one of the other possibilities that were never entirely out of the picture. As said before, observing is a word Luhmann uses for the unconscious act of drawing a distinction. Just as the border that creates the difference between system and environment also creates the living cell, so too does observation create the observer. An observer can be a conscious human being and an institution, or in Luhmann's terms, psychic systems and social systems. Since observations always imply a selection, they create a blind spot. This becomes clearer when we turn our attention to the observer itself. An observing system cannot observe itself while observing. The act of drawing a distinction is not itself part of the distinction and therefore not observable. We would need a second-order observer on a higher level to observe the first observation. So we either need a different observer, or the first observer needs to take a step back, metaphorically speaking. This insight gave rise to second-order observation, or second-order cybernetics, as one of the key features of systems theory. Rather than simply observing the world, systems theory examines how observers observe the world. Luhmann uses the word meaning in a different way from how we usually understand it. In Luhmann's theory, meaning or sense is a way of organizing human experience. Systems are able to perceive an overwhelming amount of information about their environment and themselves. Psychic and social systems have to make sense of it, so to speak, and reduce complexity. An actualized identity is therefore a preliminary outcome of an operation that processes information in the medium meaning. Meaning functions as a method of selection that reduces complexity for psychic and social systems. These systems cannot not process information in the medium meaning. Just as everything can be negated, everything has meaning. The only thing that cannot be effectively negated is meaning itself. Yes, there could be a world without meaning, but we can only imagine it in a way that makes sense. Luhmann is very stingy when it comes to giving real-life examples, but I was able to find one. We sit down at the table, one on this side and therefore the other on the opposite side, to play chess on the table. Since the pieces wobble because the table wobbles, I fetch a piece of cardboard to slip under one of the legs. My partner interrupts the game for a while, which I had anticipated, and so on. The meaning of each thing, event, and action always presents itself as more than is momentarily actualized. One could also avoid the wobbling by not leaning on the table during the game, but that would require more disciplining of the individuals and the inclusion of this disciplining into the social system of the game. Hence, the meaning of objects, events, and actions includes references to systems being burdened or relieved, to forthcoming states, and to future pasts, and so on. Luhmann set his systems theory against what he called the Old European Ontology. I will briefly touch on his refutation of one-valued ontology, representationalism, and the idea of an all-encompassing whole. Meaning, as Luhmann understands it, is unstable, dynamic, and finite. It is the ongoing actualization of possibilities. In Luhmann's systems theory, selection and negation are a process in time. By contrast, in theories based on two-valued logic, truth is static, and there is a final negation that eliminates the other side and leaves only the eternal, unnegatable one-valuedness. In the Old European Ontology, unrest originates solely in the subject, while the object is regarded as perfectly identical with itself. The necessity for constant reselection was interpreted as the turmoil of the human mind, which had to be calmed by attaining a final, universal contexture or by becoming one with a one-valued, static truth. Systems theory, however, insists that the revision of selections is crucial, for it allows a system to reproduce itself over time and to cope with complexity. According to the traditional theory of representationalism, there is no need to reduce complexity. The complexity of consciousness and the complexity of the world are assumed to be identical. Otherwise, one could never become one with the truth. Only by placing consciousness in an asymmetrical relation to its environment can complexity be thematized. As I've already mentioned, the observer cannot observe itself and therefore belongs to the excluded third. This insight is generated by an observation of the observer. However, the observer of observers also cannot see itself. There cannot be an observation that does not produce a blind spot. Second-order observation can, in principle, extend to the nth order, but it can never reach a vantage point that encompasses everything. The philosopher Thomas Browne wrote in 1643 in his book Religio Medici that everything is something but by a distinction, except for God. The wholeness that Thomas Browne named God is, in Luhmann's terms, the inside of a distinction that has no outside. Niklas of Cusa conceptualized it as the coincidentia oppositorum, a one-valued wholeness. In Luhmann's systems theory, by contrast, such wholeness is not observable, because observation always involves negation as well as an outside, an unmentioned position from which any wholeness can be critiqued and deconstructed. Luhmann exemplifies it by asking how the world could observe itself. From the perspective of systems theory, this is impossible for many reasons. First, the observer of the world cannot be part of the observation, that is, the observation produces a blind spot lying outside the observed world. Second, the world must be distinguished from something else to be observable. Third, the world cannot be an observing system because systems only exist through the system-environment distinction, and the world has no environment. In all cases, we would have to posit a kind of superworld that contains the original world, which in turn leads to an infinite regress of ever larger worlds. Contrary, in Luhmann's systems theory, the world is not a container or the sum of all things, but a horizon of a designation. Observations create the world as background. In this case, world does not refer to the wholeness of things, but to the unobservable that reproduces itself in every observation, and that still remains as a horizon when multiple observations are coupled. Luhmann saw that the explanatory models of classical sociology were not fit to make sense of modern society. The increasing complexity of modern society called for a sociology that was able to handle complexity without falling back to monocausal explanations. Luhmann sought to create a value-free descriptive sociology to avoid a re-ideologization of German social sciences, overcome the technophobia of German philosophy, and move away from what he saw as the outdated concept of reason of the Old European tradition. What I presented here is only a tiny part of Luhmann's gigantic theory. I chose it because it fits well with the topic of this video series. In Gotthard Günther's transition from monocontextuality to polycontextuality, Luhmann saw a way to overcome the Old European Ontology. Nonetheless, Luhmann's theory also diverges from Günther's in many aspects. Günther tried to translate the esoteric philosophy of German idealism into a universal formal logical system that is based on the introduction of a rejection value that transcends two-valued logic. Luhmann does not adopt the idea of a rejection value and is not interested in the logical calculi of Günther and Spencer Brown. Instead, his theory can be seen as an attempt to transform logical philosophical systems into a cybernetic theory of social systems. For him, this had many advantages, particularly when it comes to handling self-reference and the paradoxes it creates. In this shift, the old philosophical notion of system as the ideal form of science is turned into systems as self-reproducing operational processes. I found Luhmann's texts quite demanding. There is a lot that I do not yet understand, and I've probably gotten some things wrong, so I can't really say whether his theory lives up to its own claims. But maybe someone watching this will find it helpful or be able to correct me.